Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery for another Dhamma session. So I'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll start going through the Mangala Sutta. So we can start by paying our respects to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So as mentioned, we'll be going through the Mangala Sutta, sometimes also called the Maha Mangala Sutta. And this is a very popular sutta for Paritta chanting. So when monks are reciting Paritta chants, so verses of protection and blessings, this is a very commonly recited one in all Theravada Buddhist traditions. This is one of the most commonly recited suttas for the purpose of blessing chants. And it's a pretty short sutta. It's from the Khuddaka Nikaya. And it appears a couple of places, but usually when we refer to it, we refer to the Khuddaka Pata. So it's Sutta number 5 from the Khuddaka Pata, first book of the Khuddaka Nikaya, which itself is a collection. The Khuddaka Pata is a collection of a handful of short suttas which are commonly used for chanting and which are reminders of some of the standard principles of Buddhist practice. So I'll go ahead and start going through the discourse in Pāli, and as I go along, I'll explain the meanings of each of these verses. So the sutta begins, Evang me sutang ekang samayang bhagavasavatiyang vaharti jetavanayanatapinakasa arame. So thus have I heard on one occasion, the fortunate one, the Buddha, was living at Savatthi, at Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's monastery. So this is the most common opening for a sutta. So the Buddha gave many, many teachings in Savatthi and spent much of his time in or near Savatthi. The Sanskrit name, which is also well known, is Shravasti. And if you go to India these days, you can still visit the Savatthi if you're interested. So the sutta says, Atiko anyatara devata abhikantai ratya abhikantavanna kevala kapang jetavanang obasetva yena bhagavatenu pasankami. So this is saying that late at night, a certain beautiful deva, so deva is an angel or a celestial being, a heavenly spirit. So this is someone who, on account of their good karma, their merit, their good deeds, has been reborn in a very pleasant state of being. So in one of the heaven realms. And the sutta doesn't specify what heaven realm this particular deva is part of. It's not relevant to the discourse, so it isn't mentioned. So the deva goes to the Buddha, and it says, Upasankamitva bhagavantang abhivadetva ekamantang attasi. So the deva paid respects to the Buddha and stood to one side. This is an interesting detail, by the way. Normally when lay people would go to see the Buddha, after bowing to the Buddha, they would sit to one side. But devas will usually stand to one side. So this is a minor point of interest, but not of too much significance. And the sutta continues, Ekamantang tata kosa devata bhagavantang gataya ajabasi. So then the deva recited these verses to the Buddha. The Deva says, Bahudeva manusacha mangalani achintayong. So he's saying there are many celestial and human beings, so both devas and humans, who think about blessings. So mangalani achintayong. So achintaya is from the verb chinteti, which means to think about something. It's related to the word chitta. So he's saying both heavenly beings and human beings, they think about blessings. So they wonder what blessings really are. What does it mean to be blessed? How does one produce blessings or experience blessings? So this is the start of the Deva's question. And the Deva says, Akankamana sotanang bruhi mangalamuttamang. So akankamana means wishing for or hoping for. And sotanang, soti literally means well-being. So it's from the prefix su, which means good or beneficial or well or happy. And atti or atta, which means, so atti means there is, and atta would mean benefit. So soti means well-being, quite literally, or benefits. So akankamana sotanang means wishing for blessings, wishing for well-being. And the Deva says, Bruhi mangalamuttamang. So please tell us what the highest blessings are. So this is the Deva's question. The Deva is saying both celestial and human beings think about blessings. So wishing for our well-being, please explain to us what blessings are, what the highest blessings are. And then this is where the Buddha's teachings begin. And often when the sutta is being recited, often the opening part with the Deva's question is omitted. And it simply begins directly with the Buddha's reply, which starts here with Asevana cha balanang pandita nancha sevana puja cha pujaneyanang etam mangalamuttamang. So asevana cha balanang means not associating with fools. So not spending time with foolish people. So this is a very important statement. So the Mangala Sutta is arranged as a gradual progression. So starting with very ordinary things and leading all the way up to the highest blessings of Buddhist practice. So the Buddha is starting here with the absolute basic foundation. If you want to have a good life, a blessed life, a fortunate life, the most basic thing is don't hang out with fools. So the people that we spend time with have a very strong effect on us, whether we want them to or not. The people that we spend time with tend to influence us. If you spend time with people who have bad habits, who are foolish, who are unwise, who make bad choices, then we're going to be influenced to acting in similar ways, which will lead to our harm and detriment. So instead, the Buddha says, Pandita nancha sevana. In other words, spend time with wise people. So Pandita is a wise person. Puja cha pujane yanang means, and honor those who are worthy of honor. Give respects to those who are respectable. So this also is an important statement because we should be looking in our lives for who in our life has qualities which are respectable, which are praiseworthy, which are honorable. And we should suitably honor and respect people with those good qualities. So, of course, the most honorable person is the Buddha. The Buddha has the most respectable and praiseworthy qualities. So naturally, that's who we honor first and foremost. And then also, if you have the good fortune to know any awakened beings, so arhants, non-returners, once-returners, stream enterers, then of course those people are also very worthy of respect. And also the monastic sangha, so the community of bhikkhus and bhikkhunis are worthy of respect. And anybody who has any wholesome traits or qualities is respectable to that extent. So even someone who they're generous, well, that generosity makes them a respectable person. Or somebody who has a good knowledge of the suttas, well, that makes them a respectable person. Or somebody who likes to meditate, well, that makes them a respectable person. So this also is interesting here because the Buddha is subtly encouraging us to look for respectable qualities in other people. And it's important to make a distinction, by the way, between a person and their qualities. So if somebody, for example, has good generosity, but their samadhi is not so good, well, you're not respecting the person, but you're respecting the quality of generosity that they have. Which means you do have the wisdom to distinguish between a person's good traits and less good traits, between their admirable qualities and their not very admirable qualities. So it's the admirable qualities that we're praising and honoring and respecting, not necessarily all the qualities that a person currently has. So then the Buddha continues with his answer, so describing what the highest blessings are. So next the Buddha says, Patirupa de savaso cha pube cha katapunyata attasamma paneri cha etang mangalamuttamang. So patirupa de savaso. Patirupa means proper or appropriate. Desa is location, and vasa means living. So patirupa de savaso means living in a suitable place. So how do we define a suitable place? Well, a suitable place is a place which helps one to develop wholesome qualities and which does not contribute to unwholesome qualities. That's the basic minimum. And suitable place would also optimally mean a place where you have access to Buddhist temples, Buddhist monasteries, a place where you have access to opportunities to practice the Dhamma. So again, places where you can learn about the Dhamma, where you can do meditation, where you can do dana. So that's having that accessible where you live is part of what defines a suitable dwelling place. Also a place where you can meet your basic needs. So basic needs of food, clothing, shelter, and medical care, which is not necessarily your wants. So these days we have lots of wants, but there's a big difference between wants and needs. So needs are your actual basic survival necessities. And we tend to want far more than what we actually need. So if you've got your basic needs met, you have access to the Dhamma, there's monasteries that you can go and visit close by. That all makes for a very suitable living place, the kind of living place that will contribute to your well-being and happiness. And also, again, optimally a place where you're surrounded by good people. Coming back to the first line, so not spending time with fools, instead spending time with the wise. While a suitable dwelling place is a place where you have access to wise people, and you're not constantly surrounded by unwise people. And next he says, Pube chakata punyata. This means that previously you have made merit. So this means that you've accumulated good karma in the past, which means you currently are experiencing the positive effects of the good karma that you've made in the past. You're experiencing the blessings of whatever good deeds you've done before. So Pube chakata punyata. This is recognizing that the current conditions that we're experiencing right in this moment are the product of past karma. So if you want good blessings in your life, then you need to make sure that you accumulate good karma. So we can't control what we've done in the past, but we can make a commitment that from now onwards, we're going to always do good deeds, wholesome actions, which then produce the merit, the good karma that leads to blessings in the future. And next he says, Atta samma paneri cha. So atta means self, samma means correctly or rightly, and panedi means to direct something. So atta samapaniti means to direct yourself correctly. So apply yourself in a wholesome direction. So put forth effort in pointing yourself towards doing things that are wholesome and beneficial, things that lead to wisdom, that lead to serenity, that lead to kindness. And in everything that we do, always trying to keep ourselves in line with the Noble Eightfold Path. And the next verse here, the Buddha says, Bahu sachancha sipancha vanyocha susikito subhasitacha yavacha etam mangalamuttamang. Bahu sachancha. So bahu means much or many, and sacha means truth. So bahu sacha means you know a lot. You have a lot of knowledge, a lot of information about what's true. And in the suttas, bahu sacha usually refers to knowing a lot about the Dhamma. So this term appears in a number of places in the suttas, and this is its usual meaning. It means that you know a lot about the Buddha's teachings, because that's the highest kind of truth. But it also is used in a more general sense, just to mean having a lot of knowledge. So this actually is a blessing. Someone who is ignorant, who has very little knowledge about the world, life tends to be very confusing and mystifying and challenging. But if one has a lot of knowledge and information, then that can make it easier to navigate the world and easier to understand our experiences. So even a lot of ordinary worldly knowledge can still bring happiness and blessings to one's life. But the best kind of knowledge is knowledge about the Dhamma. It's knowing what the Buddha taught. So one thing which I repeatedly encourage for everyone to do is to read through all the suttas, cover to cover, at least once in your life. It doesn't take very long. And it will radically alter how you experience life. It will radically alter your perspective on Buddhist practice for the better. So read through the Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya, and Anguttara Nikaya, cover to cover at least once. And your life will never be the same. It will only improve. So bahu sachancha, sippancha. So sippang means a craft, a skill. So some kind of talent or ability. So it might be something like carpentry or woodworking, or it might be computer programming or cooking or anything. But this is something which also brings a blessing to our life, is knowing how to do something, having some kind of skill or ability in any kind of profitable or beneficial enterprise, anything whatsoever. And again, knowing how to do things is something which makes our life more pleasant and more rewarding. And of course, the greatest craft is the craft of training our own mind. That's the highest skill to develop. But the Buddha here is also talking in ordinary terms. Just in ordinary terms, being able to do things is very beneficial. If something's broken in your house, can you fix it? If you're hungry, can you make your own food? If there's a tear in your clothes, can you sew it up? So knowing basic skills in your life is something which brings a sense of happiness and ease. Next, the Buddha says, Vinayocha susikito. So the term vinaya we normally think of as meaning the monks' rules. So the rules that guide the lives of bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. But in the suttas, the Buddha also often uses the word vinaya in a more broad sense, which means discipline, self-restraint. So training ourselves in good practices, especially moral principles, but also just generally being self-restrained and self-controlled. So these are the qualities that the Buddha calls vinaya. So the Buddha says it's a blessing to be well trained in vinaya, to be well trained in a code of moral self-control. This is something which brings a lot of happiness and joy into our life. And the next one, subhasita ya vacha. So subhasita means well-spoken, and vacha means speech. So this means to really closely watch what we say, to really consider the words that we're using and the effect that those words are having on the people around us, as well as the effect it has on ourselves. So being careful to always use the right words, proper words. Being also very attentive to our tone of voice. Oftentimes we're saying something and we're thinking to ourselves, yes, this is true and it's beneficial and I definitely should be saying this. But we're saying it in a tone of voice which is harsh or abrasive or upsetting to other people. Or maybe we're saying something correct, but we're saying it with a angry face, or an intimidating or scary face. So maybe our facial expression is not quite right, or maybe it's our body language. Again, maybe the words that we're saying are literally true, and maybe the words we're saying are even carrying useful, beneficial information, but our body language is upsetting and intimidating for other people. Well, this also is something which means that what we're doing is not quite subhasita vacha. It's not quite well-spoken speech, because it's having a detrimental effect on other people. So considering all the elements of communication, not just the literal meaning of the words we're saying, but all the other aspects of communication. So body language, tone of voice, facial expression, context, all these other attributes of communication, which determine whether that communication is helpful or harmful. And this is a very refined skill, which is something that one can spend an entire lifetime or many, many lifetimes developing. But it's very important to make the effort to learn how to communicate in a gentle and effective way. And the next verse in the Buddha's answer, the Buddha says, Mata pitu upatanang puttadara sasangaho anakulachika manta etang mangala muttamang. So mata pitu upatanang. Mata is mother and pitu is father. And upatana literally means staying close. So staying close to mother and father. But what the word upatana, although it literally means staying close, the more applied meaning of this is taking care of. So upatana means looking after someone, thinking about their needs and considering what you can do to help them. So this is related to the word upataka, which is quite familiar for those of us who are in monastic life. So bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, commonly for our first few years, we spend time as what's called an upataka in Pāli, which means an attendant to a more senior monk, spending time looking after the senior monk's needs and training the mind in this attentive consideration, paying attention to what they're doing and how they do things and looking for ways that we can help. And this, coming back to the literal meaning of this word, you do actually have to stay close to someone in order to figure out what their needs are and how you can help them. So taking care of your mother and father, this means being attentive to their needs and asking yourself what you can do in order to help them. So the Buddha says this is another blessing in our life, is to look after our parents, see what we can do to help our parents. And similarly, the next phrase, Putta rasa sangaho. Putta is son and dara is daughter. So Putta dara means your children, if you have any. And sangaha means to, similarly, it means to take care of them, to look after them. So to do what you can to support your children. If you have children, then you have a deep responsibility to your children. So having children is not something to be taken lightly, but rather when you have children, then you have a responsibility to make sure that you provide for all of their needs, and most importantly, that you give them a good foundation in morality and wisdom. So taking the time to teach them the Dhamma, taking the time to bring them to the temples, taking the time to explain to them the principles of generosity and morality, these are extremely important elements of taking care of your children. So of course, making sure that they have food and clothing and education and so on, that's all very important. But the most important thing is to teach them generosity, morality, and wisdom. And next, the Buddha says, anakula chikamanta. So this means engaging in an kamanta usually means work, but it can also mean actions in general. And anakula means something which is not muddled, something which is not confusing or messy. So kamanta then is your work. It should be something which is straightforward, something which doesn't confuse or derange your mind, but rather something which is optimally supportive to a simplicity and clarity of mind. So one thing which comes up a lot over the years is people will come and say, oh, well, I have a job and it pays well, but at the end of the day, my mind is always such a mess. My mind is always very disturbed and agitated. And so then the thing to do is to consider a different job. If you're living your life in a way that makes your mind messy and complicated, well, then it's time to reconsider how you're living your life. See if there's another way you can live. So it's actually better to make less money at a job which supports a simple, pure, and clear mind than to make more money at a job that produces disturbance and chaos in your mind. And the next verse, the Buddha says, Dhanancha dhammacharyacha nyatikanancha sangaho anavajani kamani etam mangalam uttamang. So dana, of course, means giving, generosity. So the Buddha says this is another very important part of our practice, is something which brings a lot of happiness to our life. Dhammacharya means to behave in accordance with Dhamma. So trying to follow, at a basic minimum, trying to follow the 5 precepts would be dhammacharya. But trying to follow the Buddhist teachings in everything that we do. So the principles of kindness, of compassion, of attentiveness, equanimity in everything that we do. And nyatikanancha sangaho. So nyatika is, literally it means people who you know. But normally we use this to mean our extended relatives. So earlier the Buddha spoke about immediate family, so your parents and your children. But here the Buddha is talking about more broadly. It's like all of your relatives. And similarly, nyatikanancha sangaho means to care about your relatives, care about your extended family, see what you can do to help them. And this is something which is deeply rooted in actually Buddhist cultures. So the cultures of Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, and the other Buddhist countries as well. There's a real sense of the importance of family and caring about your family. And it's very easy to lose touch with this. So this is something which is, for me, growing up in the United States, it's quite noticeably different. There's not as much emphasis on caring about one's family. There's a much more individualistic, independent kind of mindset in this culture. But the Buddha's teachings here is the importance of caring about our extended family and seeing what we can do to help out our relatives. So if your cousin is having a hard time, or your uncle is confused, or whatever it is, see what you can do to help out. And next the Buddha says, anavajani kamani. So this means blameless actions. So anavajja means not blamable, not blameworthy. Nobody could criticize it. And kamma means action. So the Buddha here is saying that we should try to do things which are blameless, which nobody will criticize. But you also need to make a distinction here. So there's doing things which are criticized by wise people and doing things which are criticized by foolish people. So for example, practicing charity and generosity, that's something which is praised by the wise, but which might be criticized by foolish people. So anavajani kamani means actions which are not blameworthy, but specifically things that would not be criticized by wise people. So one basic question you can ask before doing anything is, if wise people saw me doing this, what would they think? Would they think this was worth doing or not worth doing? Would they criticize it or would they praise it? And the next verse, the Buddha says, arati virati papa majapana cha sangyamo apamado chadamesu eta mangalamuttamang. So arati virati papa. So arati means to refrain from or not to do. And virati similarly means to abstain from something. And papa means evil. So anything which is harmful or destructive. So arati virati papa means to restrain ourselves from doing anything harmful. So stopping ourselves from harming either ourselves or others, whether with body, speech, or mind. So this is the practice of right effort. Next, majjapana cha sangyamo. Majjapana means intoxicating beverages. So majjapana is particularly referring to alcohol, but it also refers to any other kind of intoxicant. Anything which weakens our mindfulness, weakens our wisdom, weakens our self-restraint. All of that we consider intoxicants. And again, the Buddha says that we should avoid such things. So sangyama means restraint, to keep ourselves back. So in the fifth precept, for example, the fifth precept, which is part of the basic training for all Buddhist lay people, is to completely avoid intoxicants, to not use them at all. And of course, it's very common to make excuses like, oh, it's just one drink, it won't hurt. And the answer is, yeah, it does hurt. Even just a little bit of alcohol will blur the mind a little bit. It will weaken our mindfulness. It will weaken our equanimity. It will weaken our wisdom. And that's the exact opposite of what we're trying to do in Buddhism. We're trying to build up our wisdom, our self-restraint, our mindfulness. We don't want to do anything that will weaken those good traits. So I remember years ago, I came across an article someone had written about the Mangala Sutta, and they were trying to use this line to say that it was actually okay to have alcohol as long as you only have a little bit. So they were saying that restraint means just keep yourself to small amounts. And I found this highly amusing because that requires one to completely ignore everything else in the suttas where the Buddha says not to have any alcohol at all. So as with everything else, every sutta has to be taken within the context of the entire body of the Sutta Pitaka, which is also why I say it's really important to read through all the suttas. Because, yeah, sometimes you will encounter quotations from the suttas, which, when taken out of context, can be twisted to sound like it's saying something other than what the Buddha intended. But if you read a lot of the suttas, then you'll get a sense of the overall message that the Buddha is presenting, and you'll be able to recognize when a quotation from the Buddha is being used incorrectly. So then the next line, apamado chidamesu. So apamada means not negligent. The word pamada means negligent. Apamada means not negligent. And dhammesu means regarding all things. So apamada chidamesu means to not be negligent in anything. In other words, always pay attention to what's going on, pay attention to what we're doing, pay attention to the consequences and effects of our choices, and always to consider what needs our attention. What do we need to be especially careful about? So not to be spacey, not to ignore things, not to be careless, but rather to be attentive, careful, thoughtful, and considerate at all times in everything that we do. And next the Buddha says, Garavo cha nivato cha santuti cha katanyuta Kalina Damasaka etam Mangala Sutta. So Garava means respectful, and Nivata means it's commonly translated as obedient, but I don't particularly like the translation obedient. Nivata, literally it means bending with the wind. So it's from the word vata, which means wind, and ni, which means down. So nivata means it bends with the wind. So like if you've ever seen a forest of trees, especially like young, slender trees, then as the wind comes, the trees will bend, but they won't break. They're flexible and adjustable, but they won't break. And they're also, so they're not rigid in the sense of completely inflexible, but they're also not brittle in the sense of breaking as soon as they're pushed at all. So nivata, I wouldn't translate it as obedient. I would probably translate it as flexible or adaptable. So this is referring to our tendency to get very rigidly fixed in thinking that there's one right way to do things and there's only one way and we should always do it that one way. Instead, having a flexible mind, an adaptable mind, which is like, well, yeah, we could do it this way, or we could do it that way, or we could do it another way. It doesn't really matter so much. As long as we're following the Buddha's teachings, it doesn't actually matter. You can go left, you can go right, but it doesn't really matter as long as we wind up in the same place. Or somebody wants to offer pancakes instead of French toast. It's like, well, okay, well, who cares? It's fine. No big deal. We don't need to get fixated on these sorts of details. So nivata means to be flexible, adaptable, not rigid, not fixated on things always being one particular way. And also flexible and adaptable with our opinions and viewpoints. Recognizing that our opinions and viewpoints might be incorrect, or they might be limited or distorted. So always being open to adjusting our perspectives on things. Next, the Buddha says, Santuti cha Katanyuta. Santuti means contented. So contentment is one of these central critical practices in Buddhism. To be content with the way things are means not to have any desires, not to have any craving for anything else, not to have any aversion or resistance or hostility towards the way things are. So contentment is actually very close to awakening. If you can always be content, then you're very close to awakening. And Katanyuta, the word Katanyuta is usually translated as gratitude, which is a good word. And the literal meaning of it means knowing what's been done. So kata means done or completed. And the suffix here is from nya, which means to know. So katanyuta means knowing what's been done. And so gratitude arises from understanding what others have done for you, appreciating what people have done for us. This also, by the way, is gratitude for yourself. So When you sit down to meditate and you notice your mind is already relatively sharp and peaceful, well, be grateful to yourself for your previous 20 years of meditation practice that made it possible for you to have a good meditation today. That didn't just come out of nowhere. It's something that you created through a lot of time and effort. So also being grateful to yourself for the effort you've made to make a good life for yourself, the effort you've made to make a good mind for yourself. And of course, above all else, we're grateful to the Buddha, because without the Buddha, we would not have the Dhamma. We would need to figure out all this on ourselves, which is not easy. So being very grateful to the Buddha who had the compassion to share the Dhamma with us, so that we can live a blessed life. And the next quality the Buddha says, Kalina Damasaka. So this means listening to the Dhamma. And the word Kalina, literally it means with the time. So Kalina means timely, in the sense of at the right time. It also has the sense of meaning from time to time, in other words, periodically or frequently or regularly. So Kalina Dasavanang, it's sometimes translated as hearing the Dhamma at the right time, but it could also be translated regularly listening to the Dhamma. In other words, making it part of your ongoing routine. For example, there's a friend of mine who, whenever he's driving anywhere, he listens to Dhamma talks on his car. So this is his routine. Whenever he's in his car, he's listening to Dhamma talks. So he's getting a constant exposure to the Buddha's teachings all the time, because he drives a lot as part of his work. So that's a good example of making it part of your life. Or regularly tuning into YouTube channels with Dhamma talks. Making it part of your ongoing routine so that you constantly are reminded of what's really important. And the next verse, the Buddha says, Kanti cha sovachasata samananancha dasanang, Kalina Damasaka cha etam mangalam uttamang. Kanti means patience or endurance. So being patient with the conditions in our lives. And actually, I could give a whole Dhamma talk just on the word Kanti, because this is such a critical part of our practice. But for now, we'll just give a very short statement. So to be patient, to patiently endure whatever we're going through. So through patience comes strength and wisdom. Sovachasata means to be easy to speak to. And this is particularly understood to mean someone who can receive admonishment easily. It does have the broader meaning of being easy to speak to, in the sense of someone who people feel comfortable speaking to them. So in a general sense, that's also a blessing. But in particular, the Buddha here is talking about being receptive to instruction and admonishment, because this is one of the most valuable training tools that we have. It's the feedback we get from other people. Often our self-perception is that we're either we think we're wonderful, greatest person ever, no training needed, I'm already perfect. Or our self-perception is that we're awful, no good traits at all, serious problems here. And usually the truth is somewhere in between. Usually the truth is that we're a mixture of good qualities and not so good qualities. But our self-perception is often quite distorted, incorrect, and incomplete. So the reflections that we receive from outside are very helpful for helping us get a clear and accurate understanding of the way things actually are with our own mind. So sovachasata, being easy to instruct, easy to admonish. Next one, samana nancha dasanang. This means seeing contemplatives, seeing monks. This also is a huge blessing. So this is why when I spoke earlier about living in a proper place, one of the things I mentioned is being close to Buddhist monasteries, so that you can go and see samanas from time to time. You can see contemplatives, dedicated spiritual practitioners. Again, this is a very important thing in reminding us about what's really important in life. And next, Kalina Damasaka cha. So previously we had Kalina Damasavanang. So savana means to listen. Here the word is sakacha, which means conversation, to speak together. So this means to regularly discuss the Dhamma. So discussing the Dhamma gives us a much deeper understanding. So speaking about our perspectives and views on Dhamma, asking for other people's opinions about that, listening to their ideas about the Dhamma and reflecting upon their viewpoints as well. So through conversation, we come to a much deeper understanding. So it's quite possible to listen to a Dhamma talk and not really understand it, and then go through our life still not understanding it. But through conversation and discussion, then it's possible to illuminate more clearly what we're perhaps not understanding, or where we've misunderstood something. That can come out through conversation. So this is a very important part of our wisdom practice, is having discussions about Dhamma, not just being a passive recipient of information, but actually discussing our own viewpoints and opinions so that we're open to being corrected about it if we're off the mark. And also so we can help others come to a deeper understanding as well. Then the next line, the Buddha says, Tapo cha brahmacharyancha arya sachana dasanang nibbana sachakiriyacha etang mangalamuttamang. So here the Buddha is starting to get more into monastic life in particular. So tapo means austerity. So living a very simple, pure life. So not a complex or luxurious life, but a very simple life with a minimum of things, a minimum of comforts, but just the basics. Brahmacharya literally means spiritual conduct or holy conduct. And in the Buddhist context, we normally understand this to mean celibacy. So the celibate life. So this is where the Buddha, again, he's talking more about monastics, though there are also some Buddhist lay people who choose to live a celibate life as a way of training the mind and letting go of desires. But particularly for monastics, this is a very important element of our life, something which helps us to train the mind in peacefulness and serenity, helping us to let go of desires so that we can have a deeper happiness. And Arya Sachana Dasanang means seeing the noble truths. So the Four Noble Truths are not a concept, but rather they're something which is meant to be experienced. So you can recite the Four Noble Truths, but if you don't see them in your life, then you don't really understand them. You can read about the Noble Truths in a book, but until you really feel them for yourself, you don't really understand them. So the Buddha here, he's saying that we should be trying to see the Four Noble Truths in our life, see how they apply. Like, what is dukkha? What does it feel like? Pay attention to it. What does craving feel like? What's the connection between craving and suffering? Again, really feel this for yourself. When we let go of craving, even just a little bit, feel how our suffering decreases as well. So paying attention to the blessings of the Noble Eightfold Path and how it reduces our suffering. Paying attention to our experience of the Four Noble Truths. And then the Buddha says, Nibbana Sachakiriya. So this means to realize Nibbana. So this is, here he's talking about awakening, like the final goal of Buddhist practice. When we directly touch ultimate reality, when we finally let go of all of our delusions and misunderstandings and we come in full direct contact with the blissful realization of the way things are. Then this next verse, the Buddha is describing the mind of an awakened being. So he says, Puttasa lokadhammehi chittang yasana kampati asokang virajang kemang etam mangalamuttamang. So puttasa lokadhammehi means when touched by the things of the world. Chittang yasana kampati, the mind does not shake. I love this line. This is my favorite line in the whole sutta. Puttasa lokadamehi chittang yasana kampati. When touched by the things of the world, the mind does not shake. So an awakened being is not disturbed by anything at all. No matter what happens to them, they're not disturbed. If they get hit by a car, they're not bothered. If their cat dies, they're not bothered. If they get cancer, they're not bothered. Their mind is always peaceful, no matter what happens. Nothing has the ability to upset them or disturb them or agitate them in any way. Their mind is always serene, always peaceful, and always wisely knowing, and always filled with kindness and compassion. And yet nothing whatsoever has the ability to disturb them or upset them or make them sad or worried or anything. And then the Buddha says, asokang, it means sorrowless. So an awakened being is never sad. Viraja means there's no impurity. So the mind of an awakened being is completely pure. It has no flaws at all. And kema means safe. So awakening is something which can never be taken away from you. Once you attain awakening, then you're completely safe. Nothing has any ability to harm your purity of mind and your clarity of wisdom. And then the Buddha sums up. He says, Eta dasani katvana sabatama parajita sabata sotinga chanti tante sang mangala muttaman. So eta dasani katvana means having done these things. So he's talking here about the whole sutta. So having done everything I just spoke about. Sabatama parajita means wherever you go, you're undefeated. So in other words, nothing can break your peace of mind. So when you cultivate all the blessings that the Buddha's just spoken about, then you're the winner. You're number one. You've achieved the best that can be possibly achieved in this life. Sabata sotin gachanti means wherever you go, you have well-being. Wherever you go, you are safe. Wherever you go, your life is a good life. And so he concludes by saying, these are the highest blessings. So that's the end of this discourse. So we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I'll take any questions that you might have. So hello to everyone who's joining in. So hello to Melissa, Yankee, Michael, Matthias, Charles Lee, Rajiv, Ashok, Hoa, Patricia, Prashant, Sud, Chit, Kumu, Elaine, Cam, Louise, Juliana, Sifoen, and whoever else is joining in. So hello to all of you. And I actually don't see any questions from online. Any questions from in person? Questions about the sutta? Yeah, go ahead.
When you mentioned about association, good association, friends, sometimes the friends, they say things like, oh, it's okay to have wine. It's healthy for you. It's recommended by doctors. So, do you think it's breaking a precept?
So one thing which really is useful when people say that doctors recommend drinking wine for your health, if you look up cigarette ads from a few decades ago in this country, doctors were also telling people to smoke cigarettes because it was good for your health. They were wrong. So just because a doctor says something is good for you doesn't necessarily mean it is. So don't take my word for it. Actually, look up cigarette ads from a few decades ago. And doctors were saying oh, it's good for your heart. It promotes this and that. But now we know that cigarettes are actually really bad for you. So Yeah, of course. There probably are some minor health benefits to some of the ingredients in wine. But wine has one major ingredient which is really bad for you, and that's alcohol. And keeping in mind also that what we're interested in Buddhism is not necessarily physical health, but rather spiritual well-being, spiritual health. So alcohol is something which weakens our mindfulness, weakens our wisdom, weakens our self-restraint. And I would rather have an unhealthy body with mindfulness and self-restraint than a healthy body with no mindfulness and no restraint. So even if wine was the best health tonic in the world, I still wouldn't drink it because my purity of mind is more important than my body. And so with friends, it's always a balancing act that we need to make with ourselves. We need to decide for ourselves because, of course, the only perfect friend is an arhat. Anybody else is going to be a mixture of good and bad. So we need to evaluate how our friends affect us and whether overall it's beneficial or not. So optimally, you want to associate with people who encourage you to practice the Dhamma. And you want to minimize the time you spend with people who have a negative effect on you. But that's something which you need to figure out for yourself. Again, in a perfect world, you would only be friends with arhats. But that's pretty hard to pull off. There's not very many arhats in the world. So instead, you try to be with friends who support you and encourage you in wholesome ways. And have clear boundaries. So it's actually fine to just tell your friends like, yeah, I don't drink and I'm not interested in drinking. And that's the end of that. And if they're good friends, then they'll respect that. And if they don't respect that, then it means they're not good friends. And you might want to reevaluate whether or not you really need to be friends with that person. It's actually normal as time goes by and our wisdom grows. It's normal that some of our friends will fall away. So that's okay. Remember the Kagavasana Suttas, where the Buddha says it's better to be alone than to be with fools. And you have a great husband. He's a really nice guy. So you have at least one good friend in your life.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You know, it's about being flexible. At least when I apply that in my life, is trying to be humble, to be able to learn from everyone, or at least to receive information from people, and then you can decide who. So, we both lead a company. We have a company, and we have a lot of employees and a lot of people. With leadership, sometimes your ego kind of gets in the way, and I'm right. I'm asking you to do this kind of thing. So, in my daily life, it's always a conflict of leadership and being humble to listen, and being a little flexible, or being flexible to understand. So how do I overcome that? It's been a challenge.
Yeah, well, that's a complicated issue, and there's no straightforward answer. It's something that you figure out through experimentation and experience. So sometimes when you're in a leadership role, you actually do need to be strong and firm and say, we're doing it this way. Because otherwise, if you're like, well, we can do whatever, and then things just get messy and it's confusing for people. So sometimes you actually do need to be firm and clear, like, I'm the boss and we're doing it this way. But you also do need to be flexible, like, because sometimes you don't have all the information, or sometimes you don't know the best way to do things. So, and when to be rigid and when to be flexible, that's something that you have to figure out for yourself. But remember that the only thing that we really need to be rigid about is the Dhamma. everything else is insignificant. Doesn't really matter. So we are rigid in our commitment to the Dhamma. But with everything else, it's really not a big deal.
So do you apply that to the situation and say, well, my way is in line with the Dhamma and your way is not, therefore we need to do it this way? Is that a good measure of making a decision?
Ultimately, our own personal commitment is always to the Dhamma. But if somebody is presenting another way of doing things, which is not contrary to the Dhamma, then it's worth considering. It's worth considering whether to accommodate their way of doing things or not. But yeah, we should never compromise on our principles of Dhamma. This is the most important thing that we have.
I also have a follow-up on the same issue. I'm parenting. I have two children, one's 16 and one's 19.
Mm-hmm.
As my child grows, and she's in college now, and I'm realizing that my parenting role is getting less,
Mm-hmm.
and allowing my child to grow and be her own self. And so there's a challenge where I know what she's doing is going to lead to something bad,
Mm-hmm.
but she's not listening.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't push her. I almost want to allow her to go make the mistake in order for me to come back and say, I wish you had listened. Many, many times this has happened to me. So that's also part of being flexible then, to understand when it comes to your own family and protection.
Well, also, one of the problems with being a parent is that very commonly parents think that they own their children or that they control their children, but you don't. They're their own people, and they need to learn as best they can. And sometimes the way we learn is by making mistakes. And it's also very normal that children go through this cycle. Like when they're young, they think their parents know everything. Then as they get into teenagers and young adults, they think their parents know nothing. And as they start getting older, they realize that actually their parents knew a few things after all. So she might be in that downturn where she thinks you don't know very much, but eventually that will start swinging up and she'll realize that you actually had some good ideas. But to some degree, you just need to patiently watch as she fumbles around and makes mistakes, and offer advice when appropriate, when you can. Help out, be supportive, be kind, but also recognize that you cannot control your children. You cannot make their choices for them. And to some degree, they will learn by making mistakes. So it is difficult because you are in a responsible role where you do need to try to help your children understand the Dhamma. But at the same time, you also need to recognize that they're trying to figure this life out. And your voice is only one of many that they listen to. And your voice may not be number one. In fact, it might be pretty far down the list. And that's very difficult. It can be very difficult to have equanimity with that. But just keep being patient, kind, supportive, forgiving, understanding. Also listen. So many parents, they approach their children with like, I am the father, I am right, you must listen to me. And that's a really great way to make your children stop listening to you. So instead, try to be understanding and listening. It's like, well, what are you doing with your life? Please explain. Tell me what you're doing. Tell me why you're doing it. I want to know. So really trying to understand your child's point of view, understand their life, how they're thinking and feeling. Not with any interest in trying to change them, but just from an interest of trying to understand them. And once you have some degree of understanding, then you might see a way to help them develop some more wisdom. But trying to start from a place of understanding, because it is really difficult. Being a teenager is really difficult. And like moving into one's early 20s, it's really difficult trying to figure out what to do with this life. And it's really confusing. And it's really hard to know what the right choices are. And so it's important to be very forgiving with your children, because they're fumbling around, and of course they're going to screw up. That's normal. So just try to steer them away from making the most terrible mistakes, but accept that they're going to make mistakes, because that's part of the process. Okay. And there's a few questions online. So Michael asks, Michael asks, if one were to embark on a read the whole canon project, in what order would you recommend? I usually recommend to start with the Majjhima Nikaya, then the Samyutta Nikaya, then the Anguttara Nikaya. And those are the most important. So you want to read those three, and I recommend reading them in that order. Then after that, you can read the Digha Nikaya. And then once you're done with the Digha Nikaya, you read the first 6 books of the Khuddaka Nikaya. So the Dhammapada, Suttanipata, Itivutaka, Udana, Therigatha. Am I missing one? Dhammapada, Udana, Suttanipata, Itivutaka, Therigatha. Yeah, that's right. So that's the order I'd recommend. Again, Majjhima Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya, and Anguttara Nikaya. Start with those 3. Then the Digha, then the first 6 books of the Khuddaka. Then Facebook user asks, how to calm down someone close to us when they're unable to sleep due to anxiety. That's pretty off topic. I'd recommend bringing that to Monk Chat tomorrow evening. Prashant asks, what is the difference between Majjapana Sanyamo and Surameya Majjapamadhatthana? It's basically the same thing. Same idea. Avoid using intoxicants of any sort, anything that weakens your mindfulness and wisdom. Patricia asks, would you please speak more about avoiding the company of fools? I found it quite liberating advice. Yeah, again, the Buddha says that it's better to be alone than to be with fools. So evaluate your friendships. Evaluate whether the people you spend time with are encouraging you to be a better person or a worse person. Whether they encourage you to be more wholesome or less wholesome. And if someone, overall, their effect is that they're making you a worse person, well, then stop spending time with them. It's poisonous. You don't want to poison yourself. Prashant asks, what's the difference between Oh, I just answered that. Yeah. Again, it's the same. Just don't use intoxicants at all. And that's the last question from online. So I think we'll go ahead and end it this time. So we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.